Jesus Christ, the brutal world he lived in, the forces that shaped the man and his mission. The latest science has revealed new information about the last days of Jesus' life. Why he was seen as such a threat by the authorities. That some of the most famous sites commemorating the Passion are in the wrong place. And the stark realities behind the tragedy and the triumph of his crucifixion. Three experts have made a remarkable quest through the Holy Land in search of the historical Jesus. Baptist minister and theologian Alan Callahan, biblical studies expert Rachel Haverlock, and archaeologist Byron McCain. The last stop on their journey is Jerusalem, as it was for Jesus. Jesus had gained a large following as a preacher and miracle worker. He promised his fellow Jews salvation from the cruelty of the Romans who occupied their land and from the corrupt Jewish ruling elite. There was to be a new regime, the kingdom of God, which would transform their lives. When Jesus was around 30 years old, he brought his message to Jerusalem, the center of religious and political power. The Gospels say he was hailed as the King of the Jews, the Son of God. Such claims were religiously and politically provocative. Jesus arrived during the feast of Passover. It celebrated the liberation of the ancient Israelites from slavery in Egypt. The authorities were already in a state of high alert.
Throughout the first century, Jerusalem, particularly during the festivals, was really a tinderbox, and it took very little to ignite the flames of rebellion in this city.
The Jerusalem temple was at the heart of the Jewish religion. It was controlled by a wealthy priestly elite. But they held on to power only by cooperating with the Romans. Many Jews condemned this as a deal with the devil.
Anyone who gets close to power is touched by it. I'm not saying that the priesthood itself was corrupt, but there were individuals who cut all kinds of deals, and this was really a problem for Jesus.
Within the temple itself, there was a market with stalls for currency exchange, the money changers, and people selling animals for sacrifice. The Gospels tell how seeing such commerce so close to the house of God angered Jesus.
Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers."
The disturbance Jesus caused would have been noticed. Roman troops kept the temple under surveillance from their fortress that overlooked it. The Romans and the Jewish priesthood identified Jesus as a troublemaker. At this moment, Jesus could have left Jerusalem safely, having made his protest. Instead, he stayed put, baptizing and preaching in full view of the authorities. Jerusalem was so crowded at Passover that Jesus and his followers had to stay outside of town, on the Mount of Olives, just across the Kidron Valley. Byron McCain discovered that the very route they would have taken back and forth is little changed.
This is remarkable. The Kidron Valley here on the east side of the old city of Jerusalem feels like it's caught in some kind of time capsule, because unlike so much of the modern city, it has not been redeveloped. It still looks and feels the way it would have looked in the time of Jesus. The stories about Jesus during the last week of his life often say that he was going from Jerusalem to the Mount of Olives, or from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem. So he certainly walked along this trail.
The Kidron Valley was lined with ancient tombs of the super wealthy, a daily reminder to Jesus of the huge gap between rich and poor.
Knowing what we know of Jesus, he might have been rather disturbed by all of this wealth and prestige.
Jesus and the disciples would have made their way into the city from the Mount of Olives by way of a place they carried out baptisms, the Pool of Siloam. Workmen unearthed the remains of the pool in 2004 when replacing a city sewer. Rachel came here to meet archaeologist Ronnie Reich, who was the first to excavate this dramatic discovery.
It's really incredible. I've been to Jerusalem so many times, and I've never seen this.
Well, this is a very recent excavation. Just a few years ago, it was discovered by chance. You have to imagine that the central part of the pool, the bottom of the pool, into which the steps descend into from all sides, is where the trees are now growing. So, little imagination, and you have here a very large pool around which hundreds of people, maybe even a few thousands, at any given time can approach the water.
The pool was a place where pilgrims immersed themselves in a ritual bath before entering the presence of God in the temple. After this symbolic cleansing, they walked up a long stairway to the temple, which Ronnie is still at work excavating.
Can we imagine Jesus walking up these steps?
Oh, certainly. He probably used the Kidron Valley, and he could have taken a ritual bath near the pool, and then, like any other Jew, he was a Jew, would have walked up towards the temple.
Jesus spent a number of days going to and from the temple. Crowds gathered to hear him preach there. The priestly authorities were increasingly infuriated by his popularity and his criticism of them. And they had other reasons for concern. The priests were charged with keeping order in the temple. If they failed, the Romans could abolish their right to worship here, the holiest place in all of Judaism. By preaching under the priests' noses, Jesus was inviting trouble. Alan Callahan discussed the effect of Jesus' presence in Jerusalem with archaeologist Shimon Gibson, who's made an in-depth study of Jesus' last days here.
No one wants disturbances being sparked off by loose cannons during this very volatile moment.
Jesus was drawing thousands of people to him while he was teaching on the Temple Mount, and this angered the Roman authorities who wanted to keep the peace, and probably also angered the temple officials who didn't want any competition.
Jesus was proclaiming a message of radical change and being hailed as a spiritual and worldly savior. This quickly came to the attention of the Jewish high priest Caiaphas and the Roman governor Pontius Pilate.
And the decision would have been simple. From their point of view, there's only one thing to do with someone who disrupts the temple, and that's remove them.
But for all their power, The authorities were wary of arresting Jesus in front of his supporters.
The chief priests and the elders of the people conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, not during the festival, or there will be a riot among the people.
It was only a matter of time before those in power found a way to take out the man they now saw as a dangerous rabble-rouser. There was only one thing left to do: find one of Jesus' inner circle who would betray him. As the feast day of Passover approached, everyone was making preparations for the ritual meal. But the authorities were closing in on Jesus. The disciples didn't know that this would be their last supper together. The Passover meal was traditionally a family affair. Jesus' new family, his disciples, would have included female followers such as Mary Magdalene. The most significant meal in Christianity started life as a Jewish celebration.
The timing of it, just in the narrative frame, I think makes it inescapable that it's some kind of Passover meal. You can't, what else could it be?
So it would be literally inconceivable for him to come to the temple at the time of Passover, make preparations for a meal, and not have it be Passover. The Passover Seder, as we call it.
Unleavened bread and wine are necessary ingredients in a Seder, and they were to take on huge importance in Christianity as symbols of the body and blood of Christ.
While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, broke it, gave it to his disciples, and said, "Take, eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for the many, for the forgiveness of sins."
The reenactment of this moment is at the heart of the Christian act of worship.
Christian tradition has made this Jewish meal its own and turned it into maybe the most distinctive Christian ritual with the bread and wine.
It's also a moment of high drama. The Gospels say that Jesus knew his time was running out. He told the disciples that one of them would betray him. He even said to Judas,
"Do quickly what you are going to do."
Judas had been bribed by the authorities to betray Jesus that night.
It's always an inside job. This is the only way you can get successful subversives, right, in history. The police don't get them. They're not ferreted out, they're ratted out. See, somebody turns on them.
The other disciples didn't understand the significance of what Jesus was saying to them. After the meal, Jesus and the disciples would have walked back along the Kidron Valley to where they were staying on the Mount of Olives. This was the moment the authorities had been waiting for. Jesus away from the temple, away from the crowds, in the dead of night. What happened next has traditionally been located in the so-called Garden of Gethsemane. Byron met historian Joan Taylor at the site pilgrims visit on the Mount of Olives. Joan believes that the Garden of Gethsemane was invented in the Middle Ages. No such place is mentioned in the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke mention a place called Gethsemane. And separately, John mentions a garden. Only much later were the two ideas put together. Joan Taylor thinks that the place where Jesus and the disciples stayed was indeed called Gethsemane, but it wasn't a garden. The place she believes they stayed is right next to the pilgrim site.
So this is the place.
This is the cave of Gethsemane, not the original entrance, but...
It's now an underground chapel, but once was a natural cave, converted for use as a place to press olives.
Behind all this layering of Christian tradition, you can see various installations that seem to suggest that this was some kind of agricultural installation, a cave used perhaps as an oil press. And of course, Gat Shemanim means oil press in Hebrew. Gethsemane is a Greek version of this Hebrew, Gat Shemanim. In that niche there that's covered over by a curtain, there's a round recess, and that fits exactly what you have in caves used for olive presses.
This was not the time of year to sleep outside, even if the authorities weren't looking for you.
The Gospel of John says the night was cold, and this would have been a warm, safe place for Jesus and his disciples to be.
Jesus was a wanted man. The Gospel of Mark says that he was in anguish and asked his closest disciples to keep watch while he went off by himself.
He said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake."
Could he continue with his mission, even if it was leading him to a certain and excruciating death?
My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me.
Jesus returned to find that his disciples had fallen asleep. He asked them if they could not stay awake just a little while, and went off on his own once more. It was then, the Gospels say, that the traitor Judas arrived. He told the officials who were out to arrest Jesus that he would mark their man by embracing him.
And he identifies Jesus by giving him, as a student, a disciple, the kiss that he would ordinarily greet him with. And it's that famous line, "Judas, you betray me with a kiss."
Jesus accepted Judas's embrace, and with it, his own fate. But Jesus was the only one who was arrested. With his disciples nearby, how was it that none of them went down with their leader? The Gospels describe a hostile encounter in Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. Jesus was seized. The disciples got away.
None of his disciples were arrested. None of them were killed. None of them were injured. Now, one way to look at that is to say, well, there was a confrontation, and they all ran in 12 different directions and left him by himself. And I think there's room to interpret the story that way.
Peter tried to intervene, says the gospel story, slashing off the ear of one of the arresting party. But Jesus stepped in to prevent any more violence. But if Peter injured one of those arresting Jesus, why was Peter himself not arrested? Why was he allowed to go free? Perhaps the contradiction can be explained as an early example of spin doctrine.
The story's being told on behalf of those survivors. Some of those survivors are now leadership, in the leadership of the community. You don't want to say that they all turned tail and ran. What you say is Jesus was looking out for them and had their best interests at heart, and because he didn't want to resist violently, there was no violent resistance. As opposed to the story being told that there was a scuffle, Jesus was arrested, everybody ran, and they left him alone.
Even the Gospels admit that the disciples did eventually flee. According to Matthew, Judas was so overcome with remorse that he went and hanged himself. Jesus was dragged off to face the high priest Caiaphas. Claiming to be the Son of God in his presence would be blasphemy, a capital crime. It's likely that Jesus was taken to Caiaphas' residence in the upper city of Jerusalem. Archaeology is revealing more and more about Jesus' movements during his last days. Shimon Gibson's team has dug through many layers of subsequent building in this area, down to the remains of what might be a priest's house from the 1st century.
So, you see, Alan, you're actually now standing on the level from the time of Jesus, within a corner of one of the houses. And here, let's have a look at some of this pottery, which we've extracted from the lower level. There's some nice pieces here. These, for instance, are fragments of cooking pots from that time. Here you have a nice fragment of terra sigillata, and this indicates that we're dealing here with aristocrats, because they had these fancy vessels here. We have pieces of charcoal and shells, even murex shells. These are shells from which they extracted the purple dye for the priestly vestments. So this is an area of the wealthy, and Jesus is only brought here after his arrest.
According to the first three Gospels, there's some kind of trial before the priestly leadership.
He's brought to this neighborhood, brought into the courtyard of the house of the high priest, and then the deliberation takes place.
The Jewish priesthood, threatened with seizure of the temple by their Roman overlords, saw little choice. Jesus was a religious and a political threat, plain and simple, and had to be dealt with. The priesthood assembled members of their council, the Sanhedrin, to interrogate Jesus. The Gospels tell us that Jesus did little to deny the charges brought against him. The priests branded him a blasphemer, the ultimate crime, deserving the ultimate punishment. But the priests did not have the final authority. Jesus was now handed over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, a brutal disciplinarian who ruled with an iron fist. From his trial before the priests, Jesus was taken to the residence of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. This was called the Praetorium. It had once been the palace of King Herod the Great. Pontius Pilate hated Jerusalem. He came to the city only when absolutely necessary, such as potentially explosive times like Passover, when he needed to be on hand to snuff out any hint of trouble.
Jesus is standing before Pilate, and his chances are not good, at least according to all that we know about Pilate. He's the quintessential hanging judge of antiquity. The Gospels
try to read him otherwise. But not a very nice fellow.
However tragic in its outcome, this was an extraordinary confrontation. A poor preacher from rural Galilee, face to face with the most powerful man in the land. It was a measure of how significant a figure Jesus had become. According to the Gospels, Jesus faced Pilate with defiance.
No.
Pilate had no reason to show mercy. And so began the path of suffering, the Via Dolorosa, which the Gospels tell us Jesus endured between trial and execution.
Pontius Pilate wanted to maintain crowd control in Jerusalem. He wanted a safe and quiet city during the Passover, and he wanted people to know that if they were going to be troublesome, then they were going to be dealt with soundly, and they would be executed. And so, in a way, Jesus was a scapegoat.
First, he suffered a brutal whipping that could in itself have been fatal. In mockery of his claimed kingship, sharp thorns were pushed into his scalp in the form of a crown. Then Jesus was forced to carry his own cross to the place of crucifixion. In reality, it's unlikely that anyone in his condition could have managed any more than the crossbeam. We are told that Jesus collapsed under its weight. A passerby was press-ganged into helping out. Centuries of devotion have sanctified the Stations of the Cross followed by pilgrims here in Jerusalem's Old City. The traditional route of the Via Dolorosa was set out at the time of the Crusades in the Middle Ages, but it's in the wrong place. It was assumed that Jesus was tried at the Roman fortress north of the temple, so the route goes from here to the place of Jesus' crucifixion. But in fact, he was tried over in the west at Pilate's residence.
So, having been in the place of the trial, Jesus then would have been led to this spot and up these steps, which have been dated by archaeologists to the Herodian period, up towards Gennath Gate, through the city. It's not the Crusader route, which is on the northwest of the city. We're here on the west side of the city, and it's an entirely different route. But it's one which is very, very convincing in terms of the archaeological evidences to hand. And look at these steps. I mean,
such evidence has given new insights into the last days and hours of Jesus' life. But remarkably, the exact details of his crucifixion are a mystery. Only recently has science begun to reveal the reality of what Jesus suffered on the cross. In Jesus' time, crucifixions were performed outside the city walls of Jerusalem, where they would be most visible. Jesus was taken up a rocky hill called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. It seems to have been a disused quarry. The Romans crucified many thousands of people, but incredibly, no historian described the process in any detail. And so far, only one single piece of archaeological evidence has ever been found. It's kept under lock and key by physical anthropologist Israel Hershkovitz. Discovered in 1968, it's the heel bone of a crucified man, with the nails still in place.
So this evidence is it's hard to describe how valuable it is.
First of all, it comes from Jerusalem, from the same place where Jesus was crucified.
And from the time of Jesus.
And the second thing is that exactly from the time of Jesus, the Roman crucified thousands of people.
And this one bone and this one nail is
one bone and all we have. It's hard to believe.
Nails at the time were very expensive.
People suggested that the only reason that these nails remained intact and was not removed and used for other purposes
and see here
is the fact that, yes, the end is bending backwards in a way that they found it very hard to pull it out, and they left the nail there.
At this most excruciating moment of his passion, scientists and historians have struggled to establish exactly what Jesus endured. It's likely that the exact method of crucifixion varied. The Roman army seems to have used crucifixion units comprised of just a few men, trained killers who had no concern for the suffering of their victims. The heel bone with a nail through it seems to confirm the gospel account that Jesus was nailed to the cross. With so little hard evidence to go on, medical researchers since the early 20th century have tried to recreate the gruesome realities of crucifixion in the laboratory. It's thought that ropes may have been used around the arms to bear some of the victim's weight. In places regularly used for execution, there would likely have been permanent uprights onto which the crossbar was lifted. To try to fully understand the one crucifixion artifact that does exist, Israel Hershkovitz has carried out experiments using replica Roman nails and bodies donated for medical research. The results suggest that a single nail was driven through both heel bones, a process devised for maximum suffering.
The scene was not bloody in a way. There are very little blood supply to this area. There are no really large blood vessels running in this area.
With a lot of nerves.
But as you can see over here, most of them are nerves. So there are a lot of nerve. It was very painful.
Hershkovitz has shown that a nail through the heel bones would have had further dire consequences.
Now, the problem is once you pull a nail through the heel bone, it immediately divides. Since the muscle will contract, okay, it will immediately divide the heel bone into two pieces. It can't hold the weight of the body. There is no weight.
The victim would hang by the arms and be unable to breathe. According to ancient sources, there may have been a small seat attached halfway down the upright.
In order to keep them alive, they need some kind of a small seat to support the body. People on the cross were supposed, to die very, very slowly, days, to spend days on the cross.
Some of the stories from back then about crucifixion talk about victims hanging there, slowly dying for several days.
The Romans appear to have wanted their victims to survive as long as possible to maximize the political impact of the spectacle.
In crucifixion, the Romans take a human body and they turn it into a high concept advertisement for Roman power. One glimpse, you get the message. You don't need to think about it. The billboard of the crucified Jesus was not a static image. He moved and he bled and he moaned and he wailed and he slowly died. It would have been a hard thing to look at.
Jesus had embodied the hopes and dreams of so many followers. Now his promise of change and a better life must have seemed hollow. He was dying an ignominious death. But this was not the end of Jesus' story. The Gospels tell us that Jesus was crucified on a Friday morning. Sometime before sunset, he was dead. Victims of crucifixion were usually left to the ravages of scavenging animals or thrown on a garbage dump. Jesus was saved from this fate by a wealthy man called Joseph of Arimathea. He was secretly one of Jesus' disciples and had managed to get permission to give him a proper burial. The body was taken to Joseph's own family tomb, cut into the rock close to where Jesus had been crucified. The huge church of the Holy Sepulchre commemorates the holiest sites in Christianity, those of Jesus' crucifixion and burial. Byron McCain came here with Professor Jody Magnus, an expert on archaeology from the Roman and Byzantine periods. The tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, where Jesus was buried, is commemorated by a massive ornate shrine. All that pilgrims can now see of Joseph's tomb is a small slab of rock. In Jesus' time, there would have been tombs cut into the rock all around here. But unseen by most tourists, one rock-cut tomb still survives in a side chapel.
If you look back here, you can actually see the loculi, the burial niches, cut into the bedrock. We can't say on the basis of archaeological evidence that Jesus was laid in one of the niches in this cemetery, but it does prove that there was a Jewish cemetery here.
It's remarkable that so few Christian pilgrims come here. There's a big line outside at the shrine in the rotunda, and here just off the rotunda is this very vivid example of a Jewish tomb. It's so much more authentic.
Unlike so many sites associated with Jesus, it seems that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is in the right place. Jewish law dictated that Jesus be buried before sunset on the Friday that he was executed. That marked the beginning of the Sabbath, when funerals were not permitted. But waiting till after the Sabbath would have been too late, as bodies were supposed to be entombed within 24 hours of death. On the Sunday after Jesus' crucifixion, his disciple Mary Magdalene and Mary, his mother, arrived to complete the process of anointing and wrapping Jesus' body. But when they arrived at the tomb, they found it already open. Rational analysis alone cannot resolve the 2,000-year-old debate over what had happened here since sunset on Friday night. Inside the tomb, there was no body.
Then empty tomb is a problem, admittedly so, because that's really where history and archaeology and comparative religion leave off, and some kind of faith, some kind of responsive faith begins.
The Gospel of Matthew says that an angel of the Lord appeared and said,
"Do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. Go quickly and tell his disciples, he has been raised from the dead."
Faith in the physical resurrection of Christ is a matter of individual belief. What cannot be denied is that his death and burial did not end the Jesus story. They were only the beginning. In the years after Jesus died, the religious and political tensions that had been growing throughout his lifetime reached the breaking point. Just 30 years after his death, the Jews rose up against their Roman oppressors. The Jewish revolt of 66 AD was crushed without mercy. The Romans tore down the Jerusalem temple, stone by stone.
Up there's nothing left of the temple that stood in Jesus' day. The Romans completely destroyed it. And when the Roman army threw those great stones over the edge, they struck with thunderous impact on this street, buckling the pavement and creating this great hole.
This was a watershed for Judaism and Christianity, which began to go their separate ways.
Christianity begins with the destruction of the temple to shift its focus. It moves from the land of Jesus, where it began, to the city of Rome, where its future will be.
Christianity spread throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The Roman Empire officially adopted the religion in the 4th century AD. It was a great and ironic triumph for the poor young man from Galilee who had been executed by that same imperial hand. Today, 2 billion people, approximately 1/3 of the world's population, are Christian.
And what's been really interesting for me is to see the degree to which these stories really are living stories. Here we are in the 21st century, and we can see that longing for redemption and deliverance is still very much alive.
This is why Jesus' story has been told and retold down through the ages.